Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Kimbell Art Museum. I'm George Shackelford, Deputy Director, and so pleased to have you here this evening to hear Karen Wilkin talk about Georges Braque. Karen is an old friend of mine and is a curator and a critic specializing in 20th century modernism. She has written amazing monographs on the sculptors Anthony Caro and David Smith, on the painters Helen Frankenthaler, Kenneth Noland, Giorgio Morandi, Hans Hofmann, and she has done exhibitions about most of these people at one or another museum, whether monographically or broader exhibitions like the wonderful show on American modernism from the Addison Gallery that was on view here at the Amon Carter Museum about 5 years ago. She is a contributing editor to the Hudson Review and frequently writes for the New Criterion and for the Wall Street Journal, which is where I suspect most of you will have seen her name the most often. She is one of those reviewers who will travel around the country to see works of art. She is not afraid to leave New York City and will go to Boston and Washington and Fort Worth and Dallas. And she's also someone who, when she comes to Dallas to see the great Pollock exhibition, comes over and just to hang out and happens to go into the Castiglione exhibition, even though she really has not paid particular attention to Castiglione in the past. She will text her editor at the Wall Street Journal and say, I want to write about Giovanni Benedetto Castiglione. And there will appear then in the Wall Street Journal a review of this wonderful exhibition. So we're very pleased always when Karen comes calling on us here at the Kimbell Art Museum. She's going to tell you tonight about her long engagement with the work of Georges Braque. Her monograph on Georges Braque, published by Abbeville Press, has been in print since 1991. That's a major statement for a book to have been in continuous circulation since 1991. And so it's without further ado that I ask you to welcome Karen Wilkin. Thank you.
Thank you, George, and thank you all for coming. It's always such a pleasure to be here. These wonderful buildings and all this wonderful art. So it's a particularly interesting experience to see work that I've known since I was a teenager in Washington, here, where in this beautiful intelligent installation of works from the Phillips Collection, I think I can say honestly, I don't think they've ever looked better. And I'm afraid that the staff of the Phillips is probably jealous. But they have reason to be. I was particularly delighted to be asked to talk about Georges Braque, who's a painter that I've had a long relationship with, as George says. Here he is, as a young man, who was described even by American critics who went to Paris to see the wild and crazy work he was doing as one of the inventors of Cubism, as a hunk. A friend of mine who lived in Paris in the 50s, whose judgment I trust implicitly, says even then he was the best looking man in Paris. There are all kinds of stories about athletic feats. Gillette Burgess, who wrote an early article about the Cubists, writes about the magnificent shoulders of Georges Braque, which is not the sort of thing you expect to find in an art review. My own relationship with him goes back to a painting at the Phillips, which is here, and which I'm going to show you an image, which I looked at as a child because my parents had a reproduction of it in the country house. And I'll tell you about that when I see it. But that was the start of my interest in Braque, even though I didn't know who he was. Braque, of course, is one of the best known and least understood artists, important artists of the 20th century. And that's partly because of this long relationship, the 7-year relationship with Picasso when they invented Cubism, which Braque described as being roped together like mountain climbers. A wonderful image, scaling the heights of this new kind of art that they had invented. But he's also probably the most boring man in the history of modernism. No family resistance to studying art. His parents were house decorators. They thought it was great that Georges wanted to make art. He did not go anywhere exotic. Probably the farthest he went was the south of France. And then he lived in Paris and had a house in Normandy. He was brought up not far from there. He was born in outside of Paris in Argenteuil, which you know is an Impressionist center. And then the family moved to Le Havre. So, you know, this is not like going to Tahiti. He did not cut off any part of his body. And he was married to the same woman all of his life. How he managed to sustain an intimate friendship with Picasso is one of the great mysteries. They could not have been more different, as they admitted themselves. Picasso, as you know, was short and irreducibly Spanish, and I've just told you what the response to this tall Norman was. But the tall Norman was a very adventurous artist. That was the adventure of his life. Apart from that, there was the drama was being left for dead on the battlefield in World War I, and losing his sight briefly, an injury which kept him out of the studio for 4 years. That was it. He began as a fairly unadventurous painter. There are few early works that survive. But in 1905, he had gone to Paris, was already calling himself an artist, and saw the radical exhibition inclusions in the Salon d'Automne, which included Matisse and his colleagues. That was the show that gave rise to the term fauve, wild beasts. Braque was friendly with Dufy and with Autant Fraise, whom he knew from his hometown, but he was painting pretty unadventurously. 1906, he exhibited in the Salon d'Automne a group of those unadventurous works, which were received with great enthusiasm. He sold 6 of them, which was pretty impressive for a first time out. But he was so galvanized by the proximity of the fauve painters that he destroyed all the unstoled ones and started painting like this, dividing the color, intensifying the color, all the things that we know are characteristics of fauve paintings. And he went first to Antwerp, and then a little later, he went to L'Estaque in the south of France, which was a place outside of Marseille, and it's a place some of you may have visited, very appealing. And one of the great appeals, of course, for Braque at that point was that it was a fishing village that was very, very cheap to live in. This is much of an appeal as anything else, but it was a place that Cézanne had painted. And you can see what's happening. The patches of the Fauvist paintings are becoming more structural, and the whole thing is hardening and becoming more geometric. He went back a second year, and even more so. What Braque himself said was that his rapture at being in the South, the enthusiasm that he felt the first year, had waned by the second year, although he still found it an interesting place to paint. He was looking for different things. He said, you can't count on enthusiasm lasting more than 10 months. On the other hand, he was married to the same woman for more than 50 years, so you can't really believe him. The influence of Cézanne here, I don't have to point out to you, and of course, upstairs in the wonderful installation from the Phillips, there are several Cézannes which tell you what he was looking at. And of course, you could see a lot of Cézanne in Paris at this point. There was a quite large inclusion in the 1905 Salon d'Automne. There was a big watercolor show in 1906. And then, of course, the celebrated very large tribute show in 1907 after Cézanne's death in 1906. And that's a show that just transformed every painter who was thinking, who was adventurous. Everyone got something different out of it, but that's the moment that you can point to. And Braque thought that these Lestat paintings, which were clearly a response to Cézanne, were his first good paintings. So he took these very seriously. They have become the touchstones for early Cubism because these were exhibited by the dealer Daniel-Henri Kahnweiler in his new gallery. And that's the show where the critic Louis Vaucel described Braque as just painting cubes. Now, it wasn't an original phrase to him. Matisse had described these paintings as cubes, but that was in conversation, not as a published article. And Vaucel wasn't very impressed with these, but he ended his article by saying, but he's working hard and he's young, so let's see what happens. That part isn't usually quoted. They usually quote the part about cubes. But these are paintings that are iconic. You've all seen them in any textbook. This is the beginning of Cubism. Now, by this time, Braque had met Picasso. No one's exactly certain quite how or when they met. Apollinaire, Kahnweiler said Apollinaire introduced them. In any case, they were traveling in the same circle. And what is documented is that in 1907, Braque was brought to Picasso's studio in Picasso's absence and saw Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which shocked him. But he left a note saying, anticipated memories. And of course, they forged those memories over the next 7 years when they were in each other's studios, constantly looking at each other's work, encouraging each other. They'd go off to the summer for different places. They'd come back and show each other what they had done. It was an extraordinary collaboration. Braque was also looking at Matisse at this time and trying to paint figures. I don't have to tell you that this is not a particularly successful figure painting. It's very large. It has none of the voluptuousness or the spatial, formal articulation of the Matisse. Just try following that body up from the buttocks through the shoulder. You see what I mean? The background, of course, owes a lot to Picasso. You think of those prismatic forms of Les Demoiselles. So he's young, as Picasso is. Braque, of course, Matisse is older, but he was a late starter. And he is taking on everything that's around him and turning it into fodder for later work. But he very quickly realizes that figures are not for him. Picasso never realized that Cubism doesn't work very well for figures. It ends up looking like a wrenched anatomy. Braque very quickly settled on still life as a major subject matter. And that, of course, is what most of what Duncan Phillips acquired in his very, very good examples of Braque over a period of time. The large number of Braques in that collection is typical of the way Phillips conceived of the collection. That is a group, what he called units, of the contemporary artists that he thought were the most important. So you have a large number of Braques, you have a large number of Bonals, you have later a whole room of Rothkos. So he stayed true to that idea. And those artists were set in context of earlier artists who even going back as far as Delacroix and Courbet, who Phillips felt were crucial to the evolution of the kind of thinking and the kind of form that the artists, the living artists of his time, were experimenting with. Most, as I say, of the Braques in the collection, and there's a very good selection of them here, were still life. This one, 1908, Musical Instruments, is the painting that Braque considered his first Cubist painting. And you can see why. It's not just the iconography, which we associate with Cubism, of the musical instrument, the tabletop in the studio, the sheet music. Braque knew how to play all these instruments. He could play anything by ear. There are very alarming reports of his playing Beethoven symphonies on the accordion. I don't even want to think about it. So he had them in the studio not as props, but as things that he used. But look at the way he treats them. We feel as though we're seeing sides of these things that we can't see. He's wrenching the structure, pulling everything up to the surface of the canvas, and then tightening his focus with that band on the side of the painting, which may or may not be an indication of where he wanted to crop it. It's still there. Or it may be intended to reassert the surface of the canvas. So all of these objects are, as he later said, within reach of his hand. And this warping and folding of form is something that we associate with Cubism very rightly, and it's the beginning here. There are paintings in which, like Violin and Palette, the famous one with the illusionistic nail, there are several of those. This one has the palette hanging on it, where I suspect Picasso was coming in and giving him advice. Because Picasso's forms and planes are always depicted in a way that seems solid, as though you could lift them out of the canvas. He's much more of a draftsman than Braque is. Braque is the quintessential painter, as you can see in a work like Harmonica and Flageolet. He loved moving the stuff across the surface of the canvas, and he would let it fade out at the edges, reasserting the fiction of what he's doing, and emphasizing the center of the painting, which he was very aware he was doing. And he said he ended up changing the pyramid of space of illusionistic perspective into something that came towards the viewer. That was very, very conscious. Mathematical linear perspective, Braque said, was all very well if you stood in one place and never moved your head. But life isn't like that. And so you have paintings like both of these, the one harder, the one more open, in which there's an actual conscious effort to create an equivalent for the multiplicity of perception, the many different ways we look at things. The result are these pulsing, fluctuating planes that seems to exist a little in front of the surface of the canvas, a little behind the surface of the canvas. It's a completely fictive, unenterable space. These aren't flat paintings. They're full of space, but it's not naturalistic space. openness, the painterliness of a picture like this is what sets Braque apart. As I said, he's the quintessential painter. He loves moving stuff across the surface. He's not interested in closing these planes. Look at the way the lines float free of many of the passages of paint. He's dealing with this world of pigment on a surface. And you catch clues, as you do in all Cubist paintings, to the origins of these forms. You see the scrolls of the violin, you see the neck of the violin, you see the vertical striations of the glass. There are all kinds of things going on here which give us clues to actuality, but don't represent actuality. But the objects on which these images are based are not fragmented in Braque's work. It's as though he pulls every nuance of the relationship of this to the surface of the canvas of that original object into a pictorial event, not just the object, but the spaces between, creating, as I keep saying, this autonomous, completely new universe of paint that is only tangentially related to whatever stimulated it. And yet, at the same time, it's very clearly about actual objects. And that becomes even clearer in 1912. Braque and Picasso are spending the summer near Avignon. Braque with Marcel, the woman he married in 1912, and Picasso with Eva Guel, who was the woman of the period. Braque saw in a window of a shop in Avignon a roll of commercially produced faux bois paper. That is to say, wallpaper that looked like wood grain. Now, it had great interest for him because he had been trained. Remember I said he came from a family of house painters and decorators? Well, that wasn't just covering the walls with color. That was doing all the faux finishes in the late 19th century of the elaborate bourgeois interiors of the time. But if you couldn't afford mahogany paneling, you could get skilled house painters to do fake mahogany paneling or fake marble, whatever you wanted. Braque, in fact, had been sent by his family as a very young man to a family friend in Paris to learn all the latest faux finishes, to make him a skilled enough artisan that he could get his military service reduced from 3 years to 1. He tried to do it as an artist, but his drawing was too bad, and he couldn't get his military service reduced as an artist, but he could do it as an artisan. So here is a simulacrum of something commercially produced, cheap, totally vernacular, simulacrum of something that he knew how to do with paint and a special comb. So it's a simulacrum of a simulacrum. Some semiotician could have a wonderful time with this. He was interested in this as something to use in his paintings. As soon as Picasso left town, he had to go to Paris about an exhibition. Braque bought the roll of paper and started making these drawings in which he included planes cut out of paper. No longer fragmented, but solid pieces that could be cut out and placed and become part of a new invented world. They became the alien objects in the new invented world. The Cubist drawn world was the real world. He was fascinated by this. Picasso returned, Picasso started doing it too. But it's clear that Braque was the inventor of collage. And he knew how good he was at it. He knew how important these works are because he made more than 50 of them within a space of about, I think, 3 or 4 years. And they're almost all knockdown, drag-out masterpieces. That new kind of solidity, these planes that could be held in the hand, became part of the painting vocabulary as well. not literally planes that could be held in the hand, but solid planes instead of the transparent overlapping planes of what is called analytic cubism. This is the beginning of what's called synthetic cubism, not synthetic in the sense of fake, but in the sense of putting things back together again. And the inclusion of the paper leads the way to inclusions of other kinds of fragments of actuality. Pieces of newspaper, music paper, wallpaper, wrapping paper, that enter into a new kind of dialogue with, as I said, the invented Cubist world. The words start appearing as well, the letters which reassert the surface and sometimes allow for secret messages and puns as in addition to being visual patterns. So Braque's invention is pretty crucial. And Picasso acknowledged that. He writes a letter, a postcard, who says, "I'm using your powdery, pasty methods." Now we fast forwarded a bit here, but this is to show you how that solid cutout plane becomes the language of Braque's version of Cubism. Braque spoke Cubist all his life. Unlike Picasso, he wasn't constantly reinventing himself. He found a flexible language that allowed him to do what he wanted to do. Rather like the French language itself, which has very rigid rules and prototypes for the way things get said, and at the same time allows writers great flexibility for individual voices. So Braque was extremely French in every way. 1919. The last thing I'm talking about was his inventing Cubism, inventing collage in 1912, and then I showed you some work from 13. He was conscripted in 1914. Picasso's version of the story was that he took Braque to the railroad station to send him off for his army training in 1914 and never saw him again. Well, that was patently not true. They were never as close again, but they were certainly remained in touch and remained quite close in spite of everything. That 7-year collaboration was never to be repeated. 7 years, that's a lot longer than the 10 months that Braque said enthusiasm would last. Braque, as I said, was badly wounded quite early in the war and invalided out with a terrible head wound. And there are no more stories of the feats of strength that are told about him as a very young man, although there is a rather fetching photograph of him standing on his head on the beach. But there were things about his, lifting a cart that was part of the Beaux-Arts ball setting on his shoulders. He doesn't do that again. He was out of commission for about 4 years and only gradually got back to the studio. But when he got back to the studio, he picked up where he left off. That is to say, where he is starting to use solid planes that in a single expressive shape contain all of the salient characteristics of the generating object. Instead of analyzing that shape or that form and translating it into multiple planes, he's finding a single shape, a single plane. And still, this is quite a modest little painting. He is playing with a kind of dialogue of textures and pattern. He's still the same guy who knew how to do faux finishes, playing the grapes against the faux wallpaper and creating these elegant and eloquent rhymes and assonances of the shapes out of which he builds the painting. Duncan Phillips obviously loved paintings like this, because he bought some very good ones. Braque remains very consistent through the 20s. As I say, he spoke this language all his life. And he becomes totally fixated on the object itself. Not replicating it, but creating equivalence. And he talks about the desire that I have always had to touch things and not only to see them. So I began to paint still lifes because in nature there is a tactile space, I would say almost a manual space. It's already starting with the Cubist paintings. Later on he wrote, I found in still life a more objective element than in landscape. The discovery of the tactile space that set my arm in motion in front of a landscape made me seek an even closer, palpable contact. If a still life isn't within reach of my hand, it seems to me that it ceases to be a still life, ceases to be affecting. So these objects are not neutral for him. They're affecting. They're objects that have associations. We start recognizing certain objects, just as we do in Cézanne, certain compotes, certain patterns of wallpaper, certain patterns of marble. And you suspect that, this is a sideboard or a wallpaper or a fireplace in one of the places that Braque lived, that he's not inventing, he's not copying literally, but he's responding to the things around him. Photographs of his studio show it full of paintings leaning on the wall, tables, all kinds of things, very crowded. In the 20s, there's a series of large, very ambitious still lives that, as I say, include all of these patterns and these very simplified and expressively rendered, very ordinary objects. The paint starts getting very thick, and he starts adding sand and sawdust and other things to the paint. There's quite a lovely story of Braque being approached by a paint manufacturer who is boasting of how many times the paint is ground and how fine it is. And Braque said, well, I'm just going to add sand to it anyway. The guy was horrified. And it's not recorded whether Braque ended up using that paint or not. The texture and the pattern become an extremely important part of the work. And in fact, there's a kind of interchange between what's real and what's invented that is paralleled by this interchange between what the eye sees and what is physically there. In other words, we see a marble-type surface, which is fictive, and then we see that the paint with which that marble is made isn't doing anything to disguise the fact that it's very thick and it's got stuff in it and it is a fictional fiction. That it's paint on a surface, it looks like something it isn't, but it also at the same time reminds us exactly of what it really is. At one point, Braque talks about making touch a form of matter. And if you think about that in terms of the thickness and the aggressive quality of this sand, this paint that includes sand, it makes a lot of sense. He writes about how color and form and matter are interchangeable, and that in fact the color just kind of follows along. He is, I would argue, one of the great colorists of all time, not with brilliant chromatic hues like Matisse, but with what you can only call non-colors. Just as his subject matter is extremely ordinary, his palette, if described, could sound very drab, and yet you look at these paintings and you realize they're full of nuance, they're radiant. And one of the best examples of that, I would say, is Still Life with Grapes and Clarinet. I have yet to, I think that's the clarinet sticking out from under something else, if you were wondering where it was. This is the painting that I would say made me what I am today. This was the painting that my parents had a reproduction of in the dining room of the country house, where I would dawdle over meals and start looking and look at this painting. There really wasn't much else to look at. And I started understanding relationships in this painting. How the grapes are both transparent and opaque, how the shapes rhyme, how those square things with holes are really standing for the mouths of glasses. And I became very fascinated by that, and I just assumed everybody saw paintings that way. I later discovered that wasn't true, which is why I ended up as an art history major. So I owe this painting a lot. And I also think it's one of Braque's very best paintings, and it was very clever of Duncan Phillips to get it. Braque occasionally, just as he had in that early nude that we saw, decided that if you're going to be a serious painter, you have to tackle the figure. I mean, that's a holdover from the academy, when if you were a serious, top-of-the-line painter, you aspired to be a history painter and staged dramas from antiquity and the Bible and history with large-scale figures. Picasso always held on to that idea. Braque was not a particularly good figure painter. I think it's a very good idea that this woman has some fruit on her lap, because it gives him a kind of still life opportunity. But they always look steamrollered. And there are quite a few of these, but I think they're better left ignored. And so did Duncan Phillips. He did not acquire any of these, which was very wise. Where Braque is at his best is in these very large, ambitious still lifes, where he is conflating the setting along with the furniture. It's very different from the Cubist tabletop, where the oval and the vertical ones becomes congruent. The tabletop becomes the painting. And then some of them got turned horizontally, so there's slightly more of the setting. The setting is just as important as what's on the table. And again, this interchange of these eloquent shapes that are expressive of everything that's there in a very economical way. Yes, indebted still to Cézanne. I don't have to point that out to you. You all recognize the kind of setup. But it's more frontal. It's more confrontational. It's more bringing the center of the painting towards the viewer in a way that is still very radical. Some of these are very large and become as impressive as official full-height standing portraits. Earlier artists whose work Braque knew very well, like Manet and occasionally Renoir, painted instead of nobility and aristocracy and royalty in full-length portraits, ordinary people or models dressed up in costume. And Braque takes that even one further by making the guéridon, the tabletop, a portrait. This is a modernist, cubist, Braquean version of the royal portrait. Again, confrontational, everything pushed to the center with this group of objects that we know so well, taking on a life that's almost abstract, with the very richly textured paint again. He paints many of these guéridons on vertical canvases. These are so much better than his figure paintings. He was so smart to do this. And as you can see, a good idea is not exhausted by a single use. He's using very much the same composition here, but varying it. Here's one that's almost identical in its start to one that he did in 35. He returns to it with an entirely different palette, diametrically opposite palette, warm where this is cool, and goes back to it again. So he keeps reworking this and keeps rethinking the idea. he continues to play with pattern. We start recognizing this leaf pattern, which turns up as fabric, it turns up as wallpaper, very stylized, and in some ways dominating what's on the table. And then we look at what's in the compote, and the compotier, and we see a similar kind of stylized leaf. So he's playing with the fiction of what he's painting in the same way that Cézanne did, where he had a drape, which is a patterned tapestry with leaves on it that appears in many paintings, and against that, Cézanne plays actual fruits and sometimes flowers. Same idea, still coming back, and of course, the fake wood grain, which he is having a lot of fun using again. There are many repetitions. Stuart Davis, a painter whom I spent a lot of time with, was convinced that the basis of any work of art was a drawing, that the drawing encapsulated all the artist's responses to experience. And for Davis, that included sound, that included everything. A good drawing, a good configuration, as Davis called it, was not exhausted by a single use. And it could be varied with different colors to create different kinds of spaces. Braque is doing something similar here. Now, he and Davis had no contact at all. Davis was in Paris in 28 and 29, met Léger, but never met Braque. So I'm just citing this as an example of what this kind of thinking might be, not that there was any connection between the two of them. But here is Braque, who clearly thinks this is a good basic composition, and he varies it, changing the fruit, changing the instrument, changing the palette, and creating a different kind of space and a different kind of energy, but still retaining the rhythms and the big moves of the original work. These are quite large, actually. He continues to mine the studio. There are also living room paintings, but essentially he's painting his environment. He's not going out of doors, except for a very, very small number of small landscape paintings, of very, very textured, of the area around Varangeville in Normandy, where his house was. 1942, World War II. The German invasion makes it impossible for Braque to go to Normandy, and things in Paris were pretty austere. There are paintings like this, with maybe one or two kinds of foodstuff. Life was not very luxurious. And here, I've just showed you this Guéridon of 1935, but this is a painting in the Phillips Collection, which is a wartime painting. What's he painting? He's painting a washstand in the bathroom. And it's a still life of the most domestic of domestic objects. The hairbrush, the pitcher for water. It is not the voluptuous kind of bathroom with a woman bathing that Bonnat was painting. This is a wartime, I'm stuck at home, we have few comforts kind of painting. But it's retaining the same proportions as these Guéridon portraits of before the war. The later painting of Braque, and there are these outdoor paintings from the end of his life. It's as though he suddenly decided, you know, there's something about Van Gogh that I haven't picked up on. I could still do something with that. One of the few paintings in the collection that is not of a still life. And it is quite significant that the bicycle is there. Braque was apparently a tireless cyclist who went all over and probably made sketches for these paintings, or certainly visual notes. They're very different than anything else he was doing at the time. Most of the late paintings are still lifes, like the garden table. He's going outdoors. He's at Varangeville, not going very far, except on the bike. This other garden painting, there are a number of paintings that are just of the garden chair. The one on the right, of course, is upstairs. The studio, however, is the dominant, most ambitious of his late themes. It starts relatively early in this 1939 painting with a big window and everything pushed to the edges, unlike the ones like this Guéridon tables where they're pushed to the center. The metaphor is that we can move out into this illusionistic, fictive space. Everything that you would expect to see in the studio. If that stylized plant reminds you of Matisse, it's probably not an accident. He pulls in the wood grain again, playing with it against the tabletop, the palette, knitting all of this together in this very fascinating simplification and stylization of actuality that starts having completely other connotations. And you have to mentally put a lot of sand in that paint, which doesn't come out in the photographs. But he returns to the studio, this is 10 years later. There's a series of nine paintings, which are some of his most ambitious. All but one of them is very, very large and enormously complex. As I said, photographs of Braque's studio show it as a very crowded place with many, not because it was small, but because there were so many canvases stacked against the walls. And I think some of that claustrophobic layering comes out in the painting. There's that table that we recognize from the Guéridon with the sort of crossed legs. There's the palette. What is that bird doing there? Did he fly in? Braque started painting a series of birds, and there is one upstairs, which I'll show you in a minute. He claimed that that was inspired by a trip to the part of France where there are swamps and the equivalent of French cowboys, and a lot of birds. And it's not clear whether that bird is a painting. It's part of the studio conversation. It's part of this extraordinarily complex, very dense image of the studio, which, if you cast your mind back to those Cubist paintings, really has the same kind of spatial complexity and pulse, but without any of the transparency and without any of the delicacy. These are very forthright, these are heavily painted paintings, and much more heavily painted than even the most heavily painted of the Cubist paintings, because many of the Cubist paintings have a lot of paint on them for all of their openness. This is the last one. It preoccupied him for a good 6 or 7 years. And again, there's this enormous complexity. We recognize certain things. We are left undecided, as Braque wishes us to be undecided. Are we looking at a reference to an object or a reference to an object in a painting? It's all about, I would argue, the artifice of making art, the difference or the blurred line between actuality and invention that is such an important part of his work. There's the bird. It's a very important image for him. It becomes a very influential image for some later artists. Both Adolf Gottlieb and David Smith seem to have made work that responded to these bird images. Braque, of course, showed very regularly in New York. He was part of the Paul Rosenberg Gallery, who showed him almost annually, and there were quite a number of important exhibitions organized in America, particularly in the 40s and 50s. He also was using the bird because he was commissioned to paint a ceiling in the Louvre, the Salle Henri IV, which has Etruscan objects in it. This is an enormous honor for a living artist to be asked to do this. Picasso was never asked to do this, but then he was never French. Braque, by this time, had become a national institution. He had been a complete radical in his youth, and by this time he had become the grand old man of French painting, with special issues of Cahiers d'Art and Verve dedicated to him. I think there were 4 issues of Verve dedicated to him, only of his work. He was interviewed for everything. He was, as I say, an institution. It's quite a good ceiling. You can go and see it. The bird remains a dominant theme, along with the studio, some landscapes outside. There are still lives, but they're very simplified. You could argue that this very large painting is a kind of still life. As Braque told the story, the reason it has 2 dates on it is it originally consisted of just the bird and the big black shape. You have to take what happens in the corner out. And he was never satisfied with it. And then one day he saw another painting leaning against it in his studio and decided that was what was needed. So you are again dealing with a report on observed object in relation to another object. We don't see that you're dealing with 2 paintings. He has not made it that literal, but that was the genesis of the painting. This is not a painting about real birds. Some of the last paintings, as I said, seem anomalous. They seem almost like updates on Van der Rohe's wheat fields. This is a large painting with this very big, inexplicable object, and something that he observed in the fields around Varangeville, treating in a way that's very different from anything else that he's doing. It's not as consistent as what you would call a late style, even though it's the last years of his life. I would say you have to go back to the studio paintings for that, which are some of his most achieved. But it's fascinating to see a man in his 80s trying something completely new, which some of the very, very best artists have done. It's impressive, and it makes me think, in fact, even better of him. And yet, the work that I think his strongest work remains the work that was made within reach of his hand, of objects that were within reach of his hand, which he was certainly aware of, because he writes that musical instruments considered as objects were special because the touch of a hand would bring them to life. I think that sense of intimacy, that combination of sensuality and the rational, is what informs his best work throughout his life. He had a profound appreciation of the everyday and the domestic, in spite of being very radical in his art. I guess we have to think about Flaubert, another quintessentially French creative person, who said that you should keep your, I'm paraphrasing here, but essentially he said you should have your life as simple as possible so that you can make your work as extreme as possible. Braque seems to have believed that as well. And he ended up with paintings that I think are remarkable for their clarity, their logic, their inventiveness, and their unexpectedness. I hope you've all seen the show, but I hope you'll go up and look at the Braques perhaps with a little more attention now. Thank you.